All right, so Nolan and I are going to be acting as the facilitators in this discussion with Tommy as our patient. So we're going to be talking through a couple physiological examples and going through the patient's insulin resistance and high glucose. So just to begin, I'm going to begin by sharing my screen, and we're going to be talking through an insulin figure 8 loop. So in this example, we're going to have a figure 8 loop, if I can draw it correctly, but we is going to be represented by a fed state, which is our stimulus one. So when we go into a fed state after eating a meal, our chief center right here, this is going to be our hypothalamus within our brain. So our hypothalamus sends a message to our pancreas, which is our effector organ up on top here. And our pancreas is then able to excrete a signal for insulin. So then we're able to release insulin into the blood. And after releasing insulin so insulin is able to bind to a GLUT4 receptor. And this then is able to get our blood glucose levels to a set point of usually 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. So usually in a patient that would have normal insulin regulation, we would see that the hypothalamus would send a message to the pancreas, and we'd have insulin that would then bind to our GLUT4 receptor, and we'd then be able to return to a normal state. And then on the flip side, when we see a stimulus two here, when we see a drop in blood glucose, we are going to see the flip side here, where our hypothalamus is going to send a message in which we release glucagon. So the flip side, we're going to release glucagon. And this is going to work along with G-coupled protein receptors. And this is going to put glucagon that goes to our adipose and muscle liver. So this is going to be the flip side of this figure 8. But oftentimes we see people that are in insulin dysregulation is that their top loop is a lot bigger than their smaller loop. So if someone starts off with a blood glucose of 200, they're going to be going through this top loop a few times, which is bad for their insulin regulation in the blood, and it requires a lot of energy to do this. So eventually it's going to break down the receptors where insulin's able to bind. And when this happens, we're going to see a decrease in insulin sensitivity, and it's going to be harder for our blood glucose to regulate in normal fashion. So I'm going to clear the screen here, and next we're going to be looking at how fructose and glucose are able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So we're going to have a example blood vessel. So this is our blood-brain barrier, and we're going to start off with some enzymes up on top right here. So in this example, we're going to have a circle represent glucose, a triangle represent fructose, and a star represent galactose. So we're able to see that we have glucose and fructose, and this is going to represent our sucrose molecule. And then we will have right here our fructose, and we're going to have a couple other molecules right here. And this is represented by, say, 2 glucose molecules, which makes maltose. And these are going to be enzymes that deal with these molecules. But the main thing I'm trying to get across is that we have receptors also. And normally we'll see molecules like sucrose and maltose go through our receptor. So maltose is going to go through our SGLT1 receptor, and eventually it's going to exit through another GLUT2 receptor. So it's a secondary active transport molecule, and this is going to take energy used through our concentration gradient of sodium and potassium. So we have our Na plus, K plus concentration gradient pump right here. And this is able to take sodium that comes in through the cell and maintain use for energy to get other molecules into the cell. So we're able to send a molecule like maltose through the enzyme maltase into an SGLT1 receptor, and we eventually are able to send our glucose to the liver for ATP and try production. But on the flip side, when we eat foods with a lot of fructose in them, we're going to see easy, simple diffusion of fructose into our system, and then it's going to go straight through our GLUT5 receptor, and it's going to be made into triglycerides to the liver. So we see that these triglycerides go to fat storage, but within insulin resistance, we can't pull this out, and we end up staying. We want to stay away from fructose. So, an example in your state is you're drinking a glass of wine every night. So this contains high amounts of fructose and sucrose. So this can have an adverse reaction in how we're pulling fat out of the body for energy. So when we're having high amounts of fructose, it's an easy system in which the molecule is easily able to be transported through very quickly. And the flip side, when glucose is able to transport and be sent to the systems that we want it to in a more slow fashion, and we can handle it
So,
in. So if you have any questions about that, do you think?
yeah, so would you recommend staying away from, like, having wine at night, or
At this point, I probably would, being a type 2 diabetic, but it would be something that could possibly be maintained better. Maybe not having a glass every night, maybe having like one glass a week, and then the body's able to handle this in a better fashion. But at the moment, having that daily intake of fructose can be tough on the body's regulation. But yeah, I think that's about for all I have to say. I think Nolan's going to talk a little bit about a couple different pathways now.
Yeah, we're going to start initially by talking about your thyroid lab values. So the first lab value we got back was your ferritin, which was 32 nanograms per deciliter. And basically what ferritin does is it stores iron. And so this iron storage is going to help with your pathways for T3 and T4. We'll get a little bit more into that later. But first, since you have low iron, you're going to have some symptoms such as dizziness, fatigue, headaches, even have like coldness in your hands and feet. And the normal levels for ferritin should be about 70 to 100 nanograms per deciliter. But because you're so low, you're going to have some of these symptoms. The next we're going to talk about is your vitamin D, which also is very low compared to the normal. The normal should be about 60 to 80 nanograms per deciliter, but yours is at about 20. And the reason why this is bad is because vitamin D plays a significant role in metabolic regulation, in organ function, and also in development. Your third value we got back was T3. So T3, T4, and reverse T3 are three hormones that you need to really look out for. So your T3 levels were also very low. It was 1.53 picograms per milliliter, which you want them to be about 2.18 to 3.98. So we got to watch out for that. And then we're moving on to our reverse T3. Reverse T3, your levels were actually very high. It's supposed to be under 9, but you had a level of 23.1 nanograms per deciliter, so we can watch out for that. I'm now going to go on and talk a little more about what RT3 is, T3 is, and what T4 is. But do you have any questions?
yeah, so what is, like, specifically, like, the difference between, like, T3 and RT3?
Yeah, so I'll answer your question, but first I'm gonna start with talking about like exactly what all these are. So the body creates RT3 as a byproduct for creating T3. And the way it does this is the brain sends a signal to release TSH, which stimulates the synthesis of T4. And then T4 will then go on to create T3 and the byproduct reverse T3.
Okay.
So one of the metaphors you can kind of use is RT3 is seen as a blank in a gun. So like normal T3 will bind and kickstart your metabolism. But what RT3 is going to do is going to bind and cause nothing to happen. And some of the problems with this is it could cause hypothyroidism, which is kind of what you're starting to go down with all your lab values. And some of the detrimental effects of hypothyroidism would be those same, dizziness, you got kind of like numbness, fatigue, headaches, regular heartbeats. And that's all because you're having too much RT3 bind in your T3 receptors. And going on, your last lab value is talking about T3 and reverse T3. The ratio between them, it should be about greater than 2, so more T3 than reverse T3, but your value actually has more reverse T3 than actual T3. So moving on, we're gonna be talking about your ACE score. So your ACE score is your adverse childhood experience score. So your score, I did a calculation, and yours is an 8 out of 10, which makes sense. You had a very